So when we talk about vegetarianism, or veganism for that matter, the ethical foundation almost always comes back to one core idea.
Right, animal sentience.
Exactly. The ability to feel pain.
Yeah.
And from that, our imperative to minimize suffering is a clean moral line that most people, whatever their diet, can basically understand.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when we shine a really bright, maybe even an uncomfortable light on that premise? The sources you shared with us raise this fascinating question. What if plants also respond to injury?
And not just respond, but respond with complex, coordinated, and, self-preserving biological behaviors.
Right.
It's a philosophical sticking point for a lot of people. If, say, eating a head of lettuce triggers a measurable physiological distress response in that plant, and we know it does that undercut the whole ethical argument for avoiding meat?
I mean, if harm is just unavoidable, is one diet really better than another?
That is precisely the mission of this deep dive. We're going to try and step back from this idea of moral purity, and instead we're going to explore vegetarianism as a much more realistic concept, what the sources call a pragmatic ethical compromise.
A compromise.
A compromise that's defined not by what we wish were true, but by actual survival needs, the real limits of human perception, and maybe most importantly, ecological reality.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Because that first major theme, the one that the source material really digs into, is just how limited our own senses are when we try to draw these moral lines.
Precisely. Historically, our ethical systems are just profoundly constrained by what we can see and hear. The sources call these our epistemic limits.
Epistemic limits.
Yeah. We relate to things that move, things that cry out, things that have faces we can, interpret. If a phenomenon like a plant's biological response falls outside that human sensory framework,
We just dismiss it or assume it doesn't matter.
we assume it doesn't matter. Exactly.
And the science of plant biology is just completely dismantling that assumption. We used to treat plants as if they were just passive, inert stuff.
Right, just passive matter. But when you look closely, the systems they have for detecting injury and responding to it are incredibly sophisticated.
How so? What are we actually talking about?
We're talking about chemistry and electricity working together in coordination. So when a plant is attacked, say by a bug or even a lawnmower, the response isn't just in that one spot.
It's systemic.
It's systemic. First, they generate distress hormones. The most famous one is called jasmonate, or jasmonic acid. This hormone travels, and it travels fast throughout the plant, telling all the other leaves to start their defense protocols.
So it's like an internal alarm bell.
It's an internal alarm, a distress signal, and it gets more complex. They also use electrical signaling.
Like a nervous system.
Sort of, but much, much slower. It's not the rapid firing of an animal's nervous system, but they do transmit electrical signals through their vascular tissues. These signals can travel several centimeters a minute, which is far faster than the chemical transport alone.
So it's like an emergency broadcast system.
That's a great way to put it. It's for activating defensive genes across the entire organism fast.
And what are those defenses? Because that's where the rubber meets the road, right?
The plant starts making defense compounds. And these are not trivial things. We're talking about toxins, alkaloids, bitter substances.
Stuff to make it inedible.
Exactly. For instance, when certain cabbages are attacked, they produce really high levels of compounds designed to be anti-nutritional or even a little toxic to whatever is eating it. The plant is actively fighting back.
It demonstrates this undeniable self-preserving behavior.
It does. And, the classic visual example everyone points to is the mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant.
Oh yeah, the one that closes up when you touch it.
Right. You touch it, and the leaves just fold up instantly. That's a response we can see with our own eyes. The mimosa is a perfect visible example of something plants are doing invisibly all the time.
So even though that movement doesn't prove it feels pain, like an animal does.
No, it doesn't. But it strongly suggests that just concluding plants don't suffer because their response is silent or slow it's deeply biased. The sources call this an anthropocentric bias.
A human-centered framework.
It's an ethical framework that privileges our sensory experience over what's actually happening biologically.
And that bias is what guides our moral intuition. The research makes a really strong point that our moral concern is magnified by things we can see and hear.
Movement, cries, faces.
Right. That asymmetry is decisive in where we draw the line.
Yeah.
Which I think brings us to that really great thought experiment from the source material.
The egg versus the eggplant.
The egg versus the eggplant. Yeah, boiling them.
It's compelling because it neutralizes that whole observation element. When you boil an eggplant, you don't hear a scream.
And when you boil an unfertilized farmed egg, you also don't hear or see any visible sign of suffering.
Exactly. But one is categorically non-vegetarian and the other isn't.
So it's not about what we see during preparation.
Not at all. The moral distinction rests entirely on a categorical assumption we make before the water even starts to boil. It's based on whether we've defined the source as animal or plant.
Okay, so we've got two pretty uncomfortable truths on the table. One, plants have these profound distress responses. And two, our moral compass often just ignores them because they're quiet and they're slow.
Right.
Which forces us then into the next really big question. If harm is happening everywhere, even to the eggplant, why bother with vegetarianism at all?
This is the essential dilemma, isn't it? We have to shift our goal. We're moving away from aiming for moral purity, which we now see is basically impossible.
All right, impossible.
And we have to acknowledge simple survival necessity. I mean, all living beings, from microbes to us, have to sustain themselves by consuming other life. Life feeds on life.
So the standard can't be zero harm.
It can't be the total elimination of harm. It has to be something else.
And this connects to that philosophical concept, jīvasya, or complete nonviolence. The sources are pretty clear that it's just unattainable while you're alive.
Utterly unattainable in embodied existence.
I mean, just think about the scale of it. Every breath you take, you're inhaling and killing microorganisms.
Every step you take outside, you're crushing unseen life. Even something as seemingly benign as plowing a field for crops.
It causes massive, unseen destruction of soil life, insects, everything.
Exactly. The research points out that even the most strict traditions that pursued nonviolence, like Jainism,
With the sweeping the path and filtering water.
right, even they understood they could only aim to minimize intentional or gross harm. They knew that the harm needed to sustain your body, what you could call metabolic harm, is simply unavoidable.
Okay, so if we accept that reality,
Yeah.
what does ethical living even mean?
It has to be redefined. It can't be equated with total non-harm. Instead, it becomes about the conscious minimization of avoidable harm.
A mindful compromise.
A mindful compromise, exactly. Vegetarianism, seen through this lens, is an exercise in ethical restraint. It's an awareness that you must consume life, and then choosing the option you believe minimizes the overall level of destruction.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because the most solid, pragmatic justification for making that compromise, it isn't about subjective suffering at all.
No, it's about ecological sustainability.
That's the foundation.
Yeah, it's the foundation that holds the whole argument up. You move the debate away from the internal subjective experience of pain, which we can't ever really know for sure.
And you move it toward the external, objective reality of ecology.
Exactly.
So let's start with the reproductive contrast, which is a surprisingly powerful argument in the sources.
Look at the numbers. It's just simple math. Most animals in large-scale agriculture, cows, pigs, they produce relatively few offspring each year.
A huge investment of time and energy.
A massive investment. And when you consume one, you are removing an entire complex reproductive unit from the world.
Okay, now compare that to plants.
A single corn plant, a tomato vine, an apple tree, they generate hundreds, maybe thousands, of seeds, fruits, or nuts in one season. In fact, many parts we eat, like fruit, literally evolved to be eaten.
Right, so the seeds can be dispersed.
The consumption is part of the plant's strategy. It's not the destruction of its entire future.
And this leads to a massive difference in risk.
A huge difference. Sustained, large-scale consumption of animals poses a vastly greater and more direct risk of population collapse and extinction. When you harvest an animal, its reproductive potential is gone.
And we have seen this happen. The sources give some really concrete historical examples.
They do.
Think about the dodo bird. It went extinct because it was easy to catch and eat. Or look at how overhunting has decimated whale populations, bison herds.
It can irreversibly disrupt an entire ecosystem. That illustrates the fundamental difference between consuming a whole animal, a massive population drain, and consuming a regenerative part of a plant.
But there's another layer to this too, right? The trophic energy transfer.
Oh, absolutely. The efficiency problem. To produce 1 pound of beef, you have to feed that cow multiple pounds of plants.
A lot of plants.
So when you eat a steak, you have, by necessity, caused the destruction of a vastly larger quantity of plant life, not to mention the land and energy, compared to just eating the plants directly.
So even if your goal is just to minimize harm to plants.
Eating lower on the food chain is still the most pragmatic compromise.
So the goal shifts. It's not zero harm, but ensuring the harm we cause is regenerative and minimizes irreversible ecological risks.
That's the core of it.
So given that ancient thinkers and philosophers recognize this tension, the need to live versus the need to minimize harm, how did they formalize this compromise in their traditions?
They developed some really refined dietary guidelines that deliberately respected this regenerative capacity of life.
Like what?
Well, in ancient Indian traditions, for example, they formalized something called Saakaahara.
Saakha. What does that mean?
It translates roughly to a diet of the branch. It was a very specific practice of ethical consumption. Adherents would eat only the renewable parts of plants.
So leaves, fruits, flowers.
Exactly. Leaves, fruits, flowers, nuts. But they specifically avoided consuming root vegetables.
Onions, potatoes, carrots. Why the distinction against the root?
Because when you pull up a carrot, you kill the entire plant. The root is the organism's future.
Whereas if you pick an apple or a spinach leaf,
The plant remains. It often thrives and just keeps producing. So Saakaahara was a practical ethical solution. It aimed to minimize that irreversible harm by focusing only on what naturally regenerates.
it's an early form of sustainable harvesting, but guided by an ethical principle.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And you see this tension in other rigorous traditions, too. Thinkers like Mahavira in the Jain tradition advocated for similar extreme dietary restraint.
Right.
And even in traditions where meat was considered necessary, you often find rituals that serve the same purpose. They acknowledge the gravity of the choice.
Like offering a prayer before a hunt.
Exactly. That wasn't just a religious ceremony. It was a symbolic admission that a moral cost was being paid, even if the act was necessary. It enforced a kind of ethical restraint.
Okay. So if we synthesize everything we've talked about, from the silent electrical distress of plants to the philosophical impossibility of ahimsa and this undeniable ecological benefit, where does that leave the ethical status of vegetarianism today?
The conclusion that the sources seem to draw is pretty clear. Vegetarianism shouldn't be framed as some assertion of moral superiority.
And also shouldn't be just dismissed because, well, plants get harmed too.
Right. It's not about achieving moral perfection because that's impossible. Instead, it's better understood as an adaptive ethical strategy. It's an effort to live with a heightened sense of awareness, to exercise personal restraint.
And to choose the path that offers the highest degree of ecological sensitivity.
It accepts the reality that existence requires consumption, and then it consciously chooses the means of least irreversible harm.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I think this framework actually removes that intense, sometimes paralyzing pressure to be morally perfect.
It does.
The ethical standard isn't about avoiding all harm. We know that's not possible. It's about acknowledging that harm is happening no matter what you eat, and then choosing the most mindful compromise you can within the constraints of just keeping yourself alive.
And that really leads us to our final thought. Ethical maturity might not lie in denying that harm is happening, whether it's the quiet chemical signal of a damaged plant or the visible fear of an animal. True maturity lies in recognizing that complex interdependence of all life, minimizing the harm where it's ecologically and practically possible, and just remaining consciously aware of the very high ethical cost of your own existence. It's a lifelong pursuit of awareness, not of perfection.